The Father God by Madoc Paine. This could not be happening. Zeus was the king of the gods, the most powerful of all the Olympians, yet here he was, bound hand and foot. He was naked except for the ropes that cut into the skin of his wrists and his ankles, and the heavy chain that bound him to the big rock, and the other chain that kept his head upright and half choked him. Zeus ached in every muscle. He could feel dried blood on his skin, even through the swelling, even over the pain of his cuts and bruises. But all this combined was not the greatest of his worries, because a big rock he was chained to was perched on the edge of an enormous pit. It was quite possibly one of the deepest pits in Tartarus, which was the most terrifying part of the underworld, which Zeus knew well because he'd imprisoned enough of the Titans there in his time, the ones he hadn't bought, or killed yet. And this pit might be a mile deep, but still he could feel the heat rising from its depths. He could hear the gurgle of molten rock down there. When he wearily, painfully eased up his puffy eyelids and squinted through the caked blood on his lashes, he could see the horrible red glow reflected on the robes of these people in front of him. It didn't reflect in their faces, though. Their faces were hidden deep in the shadows cast by their hoods. Zeus wished he could see those faces. At least then he'd know who had done this to him. If he knew who was involved in the plot against him, he'd have some idea who wasn't. Then he might just be able to hope there could be gods out there who were looking for him, coming to rescue him. But there was another reason he wished he could see those faces. He had a terrible suspicion that the leader of this gang was one of his own sons. He wished he could see which one, just so he could put a father's curse on the little bastard. Yes, curse him, Zeus thought, the way my own father cursed me. From the deep shadows of one of those hoods, a voice rumbled, "Let's do it." Another, "Push him over. Into the pit with him. Into the fire. Burn the bastard." They all spoke except one, but the silent one stepped forward, and now Zeus knew this was the one who was his own flesh and blood. The Father God said, in a hoarse, rasping voice, "You too, son?" Zeus heard a familiar, comforting sound. He opened his eyes and blinked in the sunlight, the bright sunlight that always shone upon the bronze palace of the gods, even when the rest of Mount Olympus was shrouded in thick cloud or buffeted by blizzards. He looked at Here. Actually, he couldn't remember when he'd been so pleased to see her face. It was a beautiful face, Zeus thought. Well, naturally, this was a queen of heaven here. And besides, being his sister, she had the family's good looks. But being his wife, it was not a face he always looked forward to seeing. Those gorgeous blue eyes, the color of a cold early dawn, could chill the soul at times. That elegant dark brow could lower like the deadliest storm. And that mouth, well, it was nice to see it smiling and closed. Zeus looked around. Obviously he'd fallen asleep in the garden. He was surrounded by lush, wide lawns, dotted with cherry coppices and olive trees, and bounded by rows of tall cypresses. There was a tinkle of water from a nearby fountain, and the smell of lavender. There were tasteful statues in marble and bronze. There were peacocks. It all seemed normal. He gave Here's boob a squeeze just to make sure. Lying there on her couch in the garden, the Queen of Heaven looked across at her husband. She'd known him countless centuries, so sometimes she needed to take a moment to remind herself what a handsome god he was. Well, naturally, he had the family's good looks. Here hadn't liked it when Zeus first decided to go gray, but she'd gotten used to the idea, and now she had to acknowledge that the color suited him. His hair and beard now went perfectly with his storm-gray eyes. His voice had changed over the years, too. It was characterized now by a hoarseness that Here thought sounded sexy. It was a voice she might have called down-to-earth if he wasn't the king of the gods. What the dreadful Romans would call plebeian, perhaps, although that was a thought just too dreadful for Here to acknowledge. Yet, undeniably, something about his tones reminded you that this god could make thunder with his voice, just as he could cast lightning with his thoughts. If he was a mortal man, you'd have said Zeus looked a magisterial 60. But he carried himself like a powerful king of 40 who had the musculature of a warrior of 30 who was as fit as an Olympic athlete of 20. Here he said to him, "Was it that dream again?"
"Yes, just like the last time. I think I might talk to Psyche about it."
The Queen of Heaven tutted.
Darling, Psyche knows nothing about anything. I've told you before.
Zeus smiled good-humoredly.
347 times. And I still think you just don't like Nubians.
It's got nothing at all to do with being Nubian or any other colour. What I don't like, my darling, is ex-mortals who forget their humble origins and proceed to get above themselves.
Zeus was quiet a moment. Then he said,
"She has some interesting theories about dreams."
"They're not theories. They're ridiculous superstitions. I'm certain that when Icarus flew over Africa in his burning chariot, he didn't just scorch people's skin brown. He must have roasted their brains, too. They just don't think the way we do. You must admit Psyche is strange."
Zeus pursed his lips.
"Well, maybe there's some truth in her idea. Maybe dreams are not always sent as messages from the gods."
Here he laughed decorously.
"What, cooked up by your own mind? Darling, do shut up."
Smiling, she took the father god's hand. She said benignly,
"Now, forget Psyche and tell me all about that dream."
So Zeus told her about the dream. I could see why Zeus would be concerned, though. We all knew a dream was a non-corporeal minor deity. Zeus used dreams all the time to convey messages to mortals, but they seldom got sent to gods, and they never got sent to the Godfather. I mean, they were his dreams, his servants, one of his means of communicating with mortals. Of course, there were other deities who had access to the dreams. Hermes and Iris used them routinely, and sometimes some of the others borrowed them. And they didn't always ask first, but who would send a message that way to Zeus? A message like that? So what was going on here? Was it a rogue dream, or some kind of tasteless practical joke? After Zeus, it was Hermes who was in charge of the dreams, and of course Hermes was also the trickster god, but somehow it just wasn't his style. Or was it maybe a warning from another god, someone who for some reason couldn't just come out and say what they needed to, because what they needed to say was basically that one of Zeus's sons was plotting to overthrow him. I expect Zeus hoped Psyche was right. He didn't doubt his own supreme power, of course, but nobody likes it when their kids rebel.